At 7:42 on the morning of March 14th, 1941, the tarmac at RAF Kenley was frozen hard. The air smelled of high-octane aviation fuel and damp English fog. Beatrice Schilling stood near the dispersal hut, her hands thrust deep into her leather coat pockets to stop them from shaking. She wasn't shaking from the cold, she was shaking because she was watching a hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit for a mission that might be his last. And this time, if he didn't come back, it might be her fault. The pilot was Squadron Leader Davies, 24 years old, 41 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills. He was one of the best. But in the spring of 1941, being the best wasn't enough. The Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters across the channel that week. The RAF had engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. The result was a massacre. 14 Hurricanes gone, 9 Spitfires down. And the survivors all told the same terrifying story. The pattern was always the same. A British pilot spots a German fighter below him. He has the altitude advantage. He pushes his stick forward to dive, to attack, to kill, and then silence. The mighty Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the heart of the British fighter, simply cuts out. It coughs, it sputters, it dies. For 1.5 seconds, the propeller windmills uselessly against the air. 1.5 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but in an aerial dogfight at 300 miles per hour, 1.5 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time for a Messerschmitt to close 300 yards. It is enough time for the hunter to become the prey. It is enough time to die. Schilling knew exactly why it was happening. She had read the combat reports. She had studied the maintenance logs. She had interviewed the pilots who were lucky enough to restart their engines before hitting the ground. It wasn't pilot error. It wasn't German sabotage. It was physics, simple, brutal physics. The Merlin engine used a carburetor with a float chamber. When a pilot pushed into a steep dive, negative G-forces took over. The fuel in the chamber didn't know which way was down anymore. It surged to the top, flooding the engine, choking it just when the pilot needed power the most. The Germans didn't have this problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection, no float chamber, no flooding. A German pilot could dive, climb, roll, or fly upside down, and his engine would scream with uninterrupted power. It gave them a decisive, lethal advantage in every single engagement. British pilots knew it. German pilots exploited it. And the Royal Air Force was bleeding its best men faster than the training schools could replace them. Schilling had spent 11 months trying to solve this puzzle. The engineering geniuses at Rolls-Royce were designing a pressure carburetor, a complex, perfect solution that would completely redesign the fuel delivery system. It was a masterpiece of engineering. There was just one problem. It wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe 1944. The war wouldn't wait. Davies couldn't wait. So Beatrice Schilling had brought something else to Kenley that morning. She walked over to her Norton motorcycle parked by the hangar. Inside her worn leather satchel was not a blueprint for a new engine. It was a handful of small brass components, simple washers, precisely machined. They looked like something you could buy at a hardware store for a penny, but they were the result of weeks of sleepless nights and calculations. She watched the propeller of Davies' Hurricane jerk into motion, then blur into a transparent disc. The engine roared, spitting blue flames from the exhaust stacks. Davies didn't know what Schilling had done. He didn't know that 20 minutes ago, she and a sympathetic ground crew sergeant named Cooper had disconnected his fuel line. He didn't know they had welded one of those brass washers into the heart of his aircraft. It was an unauthorized modification, a breach of 40 different RAF regulations. If the washer failed, if it clogged, if it restricted fuel too much, the engine wouldn't just cut out for a second. It would starve completely. Davies would crash. Beatrice Schilling would be court-martialed, perhaps imprisoned. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment would be over. Davies gave a thumbs up from the cockpit. He released the brakes. The Hurricane rolled forward, gathering speed, heavier than usual with fuel and ammunition. Schilling raised her binoculars. She watched the fighter lift off the runway, tuck its landing gear away, and bank sharply toward the south coast, toward the channel, toward the Germans. She lowered the binoculars. The noise of the engine faded, replaced by the distant song of a skylark. Sergeant Cooper stood next to her, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked at her. She looked at the empty sky. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The brass washer was in the air now. The math was done. The theory was over. Now it was combat. And by noon, Beatrice Schilling would know if she was a savior or a killer. To the men at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Beatrice Schilling was an anomaly, a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. It was 1941. Women were supposed to be secretaries. They were supposed to type reports, make tea, and keep the filing cabinets organized. They were not supposed to be the principal technical officer in charge of carburetor research, and they certainly were not supposed to know more about the internal combustion engine than the men who built them. But Beatrice Schilling didn't just study engines, she lived them. She wasn't a product of polite society, she was a product of speed. At 14, she bought her first motorcycle, a Norton. Most girls her age were learning to sew. Beatrice was stripping a two-stroke engine down to its individual components, learning the name of every bolt, every spring, every valve, and then rebuilding it better than it was before. By the time she was 25, she wasn't just riding, she was racing. She took that Norton to the Brooklyn circuit, the cathedral of British speed. The track was a concrete bowl, steep, dangerous, and unforgiving. To earn the gold star, a rider had to lap the circuit at over 100 miles per hour. It was a feat that terrified grown men. Beatrice didn't just do it, she crushed it. 106 miles per hour, average speed. She was only the second woman in history to earn the gold star. Racing taught her something that a textbook never could. It taught her how an engine feels right before it dies. She knew the vibration of a piston under stress. She knew the sound of a fuel mixture that was too lean. She knew the sickening lurch of an engine cutting out at high speed. So when the combat reports started flooding in from the squadrons describing Spitfires and Hurricanes choking during dives, Beatrice didn't need to imagine the problem. She could feel it in her bones. The problem was simple physics, but the consequences were brutal. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was a masterpiece of British engineering, powerful, reliable, a work of art, but it had an Achilles heel. It used a carburetor, a device that relied on a float, bobbing in a chamber of fuel to regulate the flow into the engine. It worked perfectly in level flight. It worked perfectly in climb. But when a pilot pushed the stick forward, when he dove, the laws of physics turned against him. Negative G-force. Imagine being in an elevator that drops suddenly. Your stomach lurches up into your chest. Everything inside you floats. That is exactly what happened to the fuel inside the carburetor. When the Spitfire dove, gravity effectively reversed. The float in the chamber, confused by the negative G's, sank. The needle valve opened wide, and the fuel, instead of spraying into the engine in a controlled mist, flooded in like a tidal wave. The engine didn't starve, it drowned, it was rich cutting, the spark plugs were soaked, the engine choked on too much gasoline. Bang, silence. And for 1.5 seconds, the pilot was helpless. The German Messerschmitt 109 didn't have this problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines use fuel injection. They pump fuel directly into the cylinders, forcing it in under pressure. It didn't matter if the plane was upside down, sideways, or diving straight into hell. The engine kept screaming. It gave the German pilots a superpower. They could dive away from a fight knowing the British couldn't follow. Or worse, they could bait the British into a dive, wait for the Merlin engine to choke, and then loop back to finish off the stalled target. It wasn't a fair fight, and Beatrice Schilling hated unfair fights. The engineers at Rolls-Royce proposed a solution, a pressure carburetor, a completely new design that would eliminate the float chamber entirely. It was brilliant. It was sophisticated. And it was useless because retooling the factories to build it would take 2 years. The RAF needed a solution today, not in 1943. Schilling looked at the problem differently. She didn't look at it like an engineer trying to build a perfect machine. She looked at it like a racer trying to fix a bike in the pit lane. If the problem was too much fuel flooding the engine during a dive, why not just stop the flood? She didn't need a new carburetor. She just needed a dam, a restrictor. Her idea was so simple, it was almost insulting to the high-minded engineers at Farnborough. She took a small brass disc, a washer, and she drilled a hole in the center, but not just any hole. The dimensions had to be precise to the thousandth of an inch, too big, and the engine would still flood, too small, and the engine would starve of fuel at full throttle, causing the pistons to melt. She calculated, she tested, she failed. She calculated again. 17 different sizes were tested on the bench. Finally, she found the magic number. a hole exactly 0.04 inches in diameter, about the size of a pinhead. When installed in the fuel line, this tiny brass washer allowed enough fuel for the engine to run at full power, but when negative G's hit and the fuel tried to surge, the small hole acted like a bottleneck. It restricted the flow. It prevented the flood. It kept the engine running. It was a 10-cent solution to a million-pound problem. But a bench test is not combat. A bench test doesn't shoot back. A bench test doesn't pull 5 Gs while dodging tracer fire. Schilling knew that to prove her theory, she had to break the rules. She couldn't wait for the Air Ministry to approve her washer. That would take months of committee meetings and paperwork. She needed a guinea pig. She needed a plane. And she needed a pilot brave enough, or perhaps crazy enough like her, to fly it. That was why she was at Kenley. That was why she had welded the washer into Squadron Leader Davies' fuel line. She wasn't just an engineer that morning, she was a gambler. And the chips she was playing with were the lives of the Royal Air Force. The Hurricane climbed through the overcast layer at 8,000 feet, and goes on punching through the gray wool into the blinding morning sun. Squadron Leader Davies adjusted his oxygen mask, his eyes scanning the horizon. He felt heavy. The aircraft felt heavy, not because of the fuel or the ammo, but because of the tension. Every pilot in 11 Group felt it. It was the weight of knowing that your own machine might betray you. Davies checked his instruments. Oil pressure, good. Coolant temperature, normal. Manifold pressure, steady. The Merlin engine purred with a rhythmic, throaty roar. It sounded healthy, but Davies knew better. It always sounded healthy. Right until the moment it choked. He didn't know about the brass washer. He didn't know that 50 minutes ago. Beatrice Schilling had been kneeling in the mud, holding a butane torch, welding a piece of metal the size of a fingernail into his fuel line. He didn't know that his life and the future of RAF tactics were currently dependent on a piece of scrap metal worth less than a pack of cigarettes. Blue section, Vector 180's Angels 15. The controller's voice crackled in his headset. Bandits reported over Dungeness. Davies banked the Hurricane south. His heart rate spiked. This was it, down on the ground. At RAF Kenley? Time had stopped. Beatrice Schilling stood on the edge of the dispersal area. She hadn't moved. The cold wind bit through her coat, but she didn't feel it. She was running numbers in her head. Again and again. 0.04 inches. Was it too small? If she had miscalculated the flow rate, the engine would starve at full throttle. Davies would be a sitting duck. Was it too big? If it didn't restrict enough fuel, the engine would still flood. Davies would dive. The engine would cut, and the Messerschmitts would tear him apart. Sergeant Cooper stood next to her, chain smoking. He looked at the sky, then at his watch, then back at the sky. 40 minutes out, miss, Cooper muttered, the cigarette bobbing in his lips. If they found trouble, they found it by now. Up at 15,000 feet. Davies found trouble. 2 specks appeared against the white clouds below. Messerschmitt 109s. They were heading back to France. Fast. They were below him. This was the perfect setup. The textbook bounce. Davies had the altitude. He had the sun behind him. In 1940, this would have been an easy kill. But in 1941, it was a trap. The German pilots saw him. Instead of turning to fight, they did exactly what Davies feared. They pitched their noses down, they dove. It was the classic Luftwaffe maneuver. They knew the Spitfires and Hurricanes couldn't follow them down without the engine cutting out. They were baiting him. They were inviting him to break his own neck. Davies hesitated for a split second. His hand froze on the stick. Instinct screamed at him to break off. Don't follow, don't dive. You'll stall, you'll die. But anger is a powerful motivator. Davies was tired of watching them escape. He was tired of being the prey. He gritted his teeth. He slammed the throttle forward to the gate. Tally-ho, he whispered. And he shoved the stick forward, hard. The Hurricane pitched over violent, nose pointing straight at the English Channel below. This was the moment. The killing zone. Gravity reversed. Davies floated up against his harness straps. The negative G forces trying to pull him out of the cockpit. Dust and loose debris floated up from the floorboards. In the carburetor, the fuel in the float chamber surged upward. A chaotic tidal wave of gasoline crashing against the needle valve. Davies braced himself for the silence. He waited for the cough. He waited for the lurch. He waited for the propeller to stop spinning. 1 second passed. The engine roared. 1.5 seconds passed. The engine screamed, louder, angrier. The RPMs climbing steady and true. 2 seconds. Davies blinked. He checked the gauges. The Merlin was singing. It wasn't choking. It wasn't flooding. It was drinking the fuel, smooth and consistent. The restrictor was working. That tiny brass washer was holding back the flood, forcing the fuel to behave, keeping the heart of the fighter beating. The Messerschmitt pilot must have looked in his mirror and felt a cold shock of terror. The Hurricane wasn't falling back. It wasn't stalling. It was right there, glued to his tail, growing larger by the second. The German had played his ace card, and the British had just trumped it. Davies closed the distance. 300 yards, 200 yards. The crosshairs settled on the gray fuselage of the 109. Davies squeezed the trigger. 8 Browning machine guns erupted, a shuddering vibration that ran through the entire airframe. Tracers lashed out, stitching a line of destruction across the German's wing route. Smoke poured from the Messerschmitt. Pieces of aluminum flew off into the slipstream. The German broke hard right, diving away in panic, trailing black smoke all the way to the French coast. Davies pulled out of the dive. The G-forces slammed him back into his seat. Positive G's this time. The blood rushed from his head, his vision graying out for a moment. But he was smiling. He was laughing inside his oxygen mask. He keyed the radio. Bandits damaged. Breaking off. Heading home. Back at Kenley, the sound of engines returning was the sweetest music Beatrice Schilling had ever heard. She watched the 3 Hurricanes enter the landing circuit. 1, 2, 3. All safe. Davies touched down, the tires chirping against the tarmac. He taxied to the dispersal point, the propeller winding down to a halt. Schilling walked toward the plane. Her legs felt like jelly. She had designed bombs. She had raced motorcycles at lethal speeds. But she had never felt adrenaline like this. This wasn't engineering. This was resurrection. Davies slid the canopy back and climbed out onto the wing. He pulled off his leather flying helmet. His hair matted with sweat. He looked different, the haunted look. The exhaustion that plagued every pilot in the squadron was gone, replaced by something electric. He jumped down to the tarmac and walked straight up to Sergeant Cooper. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Cooper asked, trying to keep his voice casual, trying not to look at Schilling. Davies looked at Cooper. Then he looked at the woman standing quietly in her leather coat. He realized in that moment who she was. She wasn't a secretary. She wasn't a visitor. She was the architect of his survival. "Best the Merlin's ever run," Davies said, a grin spreading across his face. "I pushed her over, hard. Negative G's all the way down. She's never missed a beat. Not a single cough." He looked at Schilling. "You fixed it," he said softly. "You actually fixed it." Then the squadron leader turned to his ground crew, his voice ringing out across the dispersal area, loud enough for every mechanic and pilot to hear. "Cooper, get your kit. I want that thing installed in every Hurricane on the station, today. I don't care about the paperwork. I don't care what the ministry says. If anyone asks, tell them I ordered it." Schilling let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 6 months. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the remaining brass washers. They glinted in the sunlight, 5 little rings of metal. "I brought a few spares," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. By nightfall, the Kenley wing was transformed, and the word was already spreading. The phone in the dispersal hut began to ring. It was the squadron commander from Biggin Hill, then Hornchurch, then Tangmere. They had heard the rumors. They had heard that the curse was broken. They wanted the cure. Beatrice Schilling realized she was going to need a lot more brass, and she was going to need to fuel up her motorcycle, because tomorrow she had an entire Air Force to save. The legend of the brass washer spread faster than the speed of sound. By the end of March, Beatrice Schilling and her small team became the most popular people in Britain. They rode their motorcycles from airfield to airfield, from Biggin Hill to North Weald, carrying pockets full of brass restrictors. They were like traveling doctors, curing a plague that had haunted the Royal Air Force for a year. The pilots, with their dark British humor, gave the device a nickname. They called it Miss Schilling's Orifice. It was crude, it was cheeky, but in the grim reality of 1941, it was a term of endearment. It was the soldiers' way of saying thank you to the woman who had given them their wings back, and the numbers told the story better than any nickname could. In March, before the restrictor, RAF fighters reported engine cuts in 38% of diving attacks. By April, that number had dropped to almost zero. The kill-to-loss ratio shifted dramatically. Suddenly, it was the German pilots who were looking over their shoulders, realizing that the Spitfire in their mirror wasn't falling back anymore, it was closing in. Of course, the restrictor was just a stopgap, a band-aid. By 1943, Rolls-Royce finally introduced the complex pressure carburetor that solved the problem permanently. But for 2 critical years, when the war hung in the balance, it wasn't the million-pound engineering project that held the line. It was Beatrice Schilling's 10-cent washer. She went on to work on supersonic flight, on rocket propulsion, and even bobsled design. She received the Order of the British Empire from the King, but she never sought the limelight. She remained until her death in 1990, a racer at heart, a woman who preferred the smell of grease and the roar of an engine to the applause of a crowd. Her story teaches us a lesson that we often forget in our modern world of high-tech solutions and complex algorithms. Sometimes the answer isn't more technology. Sometimes the answer isn't more money. Sometimes the answer is just looking at the problem differently. It is about having the courage to ignore the rule book, to trust your intuition, and to realize that even the smallest thing, a piece of metal no bigger than a fingernail, can change the course of history. Beatrice Schilling didn't just fix an engine. She proved that heroes don't always wear capes or fly fighter jets. Sometimes they just ride motorcycles and carry a satchel full of brass. If you think Beatrice Schilling deserves to be remembered as much as the pilot she saved, hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with the world. And if you want to uncover more secrets of history's unsung heroes, make sure you subscribe. Because there are thousands of stories like Beatrice's waiting to be told. And we are just getting started. Beatrice Schilling's story didn't end with the war. She continued to break barriers, working on supersonic flight, rocket propulsion, and even designing racing bobsleds for the Olympic team. She rode her beloved Norton motorcycle well into her 70s, a symbol of the speed and freedom she chased her whole life. When she passed away in 1990, she left behind more than just technical papers. She left a lesson for every engineer, every pilot, and every dreamer. The lesson is simple. Complexity is not always the answer. Sometimes, the smartest solution is the one that fits in your pocket. Today, there are pubs named after her and museums that hold those tiny brass washers like precious jewels. They are reminders that heroes come in all forms. Some wear uniforms, and some wear leather racing suits, some fire guns, and some wield a welding torch. Beatrice Schilling saved the Royal Air Force, not with a miracle, but with a piece of metal worth pennies. She kept the propellers spinning, she kept the pilots alive, and she helped win the war 1.5 seconds at a time. If you believe her story deserves to be remembered, please hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that history matters. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of the unsung heroes who built our world. And tell us in the comments, did you know about the brass washer before today? We want to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and keep looking up.